Hello and welcome back to Math 360. For this next section of the course, we are going to be moving on to species interaction. So thinking about how we can move from our models of simple populations just in one dimension to thinking about what happens when we have more than one species. And these same methods can also be applied to understand structured populations as well. For example, if there's structuring in terms of age or sex in a population. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about a general modeling framework that we can use to understand species interactions. And by the end of today, you should understand different types of species interactions, which I'll talk about in a moment, ideas about resource competition and niche overlap, and how we can describe the utilization of different resources by a particular population. And also the idea of non-dimensionalization, which we introduced a little bit at the end of the last lecture. So generally, species don't exist in isolation, and that means that when we try to model populations, we should be thinking about how they interact with other members of their ecological communities or their ecosystems. So we're going to be trying to adapt some of the ideas that we've learned in one dimension to thinking about systems of ODEs in more than one dimension. And we refer to these as being coupled systems of ODEs. So they're coupled because the dynamics of these ODEs are no longer independent from each other. So they're not just sort of one ODE on its own. There'll be, say, a second ODE or a third ODE, and these will all be coupled together. We're also going to be thinking about how we can simplify some of the problems using a process known as non-dimensionalization, which essentially reduces the number of parameters that we need to deal with in our models. Okay, so let's first think about different types of species interactions. And there is a list of different types here. And if we think about what is the net effect on another species, we can kind of summarize these different types of species interactions in a sort of bracket notation form. So if we think about competition, imagine we've got two species that are competing for resources, say, then because they're in competition, they're both going to have a negative interaction on each other. In other words, they both reduce each other's population growth. If we then contrast this with mutualism or symbiosis, in this case, both have a positive effect on each other's population growth. So an example of mutualism might be, say, plants and their pollinators. They both benefit from this association. Another common species interaction that's seen in nature is exploitation. This is where one species has a positive impact on its growth rate. This is an exploiter due to interactions with a victim, which experiences a negative impact on its growth rate. So this could be, say, predator-prey interactions. It could be a host and a pathogen or parasite. Lots of different examples of asymmetric exploitation. These last three down the bottom are a little bit more unusual. We won't really be focusing on them too much. We're going to be mainly focusing on exploitation and competition with a little bit of mutualism thrown in there. But commensalism, amensalism, and neutralism are also asymmetric interactions, but where at least one of the species experiences no effect. So in commensalism, for example, one of the species has a positive effect on its growth rate and the other has no effect. So this might be, for example, gut microbes that perhaps have no effect on their host population, although many gut microbes do. Some of them don't. They happen to, live off waste products or things like that. Perhaps they have no real effect on their host population, but they have a positive effect by the presence of that host. So they experience a positive effect themselves. Amensalism is the opposite of this, where one species experiences a negative effect and the other species experiences no effect. Again, this could be something like gut microbes. Some of them could experience a negative effect if they are normally found in the environment, and then they somehow find themselves in say, a human host. They might have a negative experience due to host immunity, but no real effect on their actual host. And then finally, we have neutralism, when there is no effect on either. So this would be a case of two species that just have no interactions whatsoever. For example, this could be things like viruses that infect bacteria called phages, and something like fungi, or maybe humans. Some other species that is very different. You could also think potentially also spatially separated populations kind of fall under neutralism as well. So for example, lions don't compete with whales. Okay, let's think about how we can construct a model that is a general way of thinking about interactions between species. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to think about what happens if we have two species that grow logistically and have no effect on each other. So this is our neutralism example that we just talked about at the end. We say that their population sizes N1 and N2 then change according to some ODEs. And these at this point are going to be uncoupled. So I'm going to say changing population size N1 is going to be R1 N1 times by 1 minus N1 over K1. And similarly for population 2. Where all of these R and K parameters are positive, and the R1s, the R subscript 1 or 2, corresponds to the intrinsic growth rate of that population, and likewise K subscript 1 or 2 corresponds to the carrying capacities of those populations. So a couple of notes here, we are going to be focusing on continuous time models. A lot of the same things that we will be, the ways that we construct these models would apply in discrete time as well. And the reason that we're using a capital T here instead of our normal little t is just a notation thing that we'll come back to when we are talking about non-dimensionalization. Okay, so those species at the moment, they're not interacting with each other at all. So these ODEs would say that they're uncoupled because they are not linked to each other. Now what we want to do is we want to couple them and think about how we would adjust these equations if these species compete with each other for resources. So for example, suppose they're two species of bird and they're both competing for the same worms or seeds to eat. So what do we expect to happen? Well, we should expect that if they're competing with each other for resources, then the presence of one species should reduce the growth rate of the other. So let's think about changing this around a little bit. So we want to update these equations we had before. So we still have our intrinsic growth rate. Now we want to think about essentially the total reduction in the population growth rate due to competition. And that competition can be due to competition with individuals from the same population or species, or it could be competition with individuals in another species. So I'm going to rewrite the Ks that I had in the previous slide, where they were the carrying capacities. Now, rather than having N1 over K1, I'm going to think now about an alpha 1,1, which is just saying what is the impact of species 1 on other members of species 1, times by the amount of individuals in that species, N1. And then I'll do a similar thing, my notation, thinking about species 2. We can write a similar equation down for our other species. So we're going to have R2N2 times by 1 minus. Here we're going to have the impact of species 1 on species 2, and likewise the impact of species 2 on species 2. Okay, so the question here at the bottom, what is this alpha ij? This represents the per capita effect of species J on I. In other words, the strength of competition. And this is a very famous model. It's known as the Lotka-Volterra competition model. Not to be confused later on during the course, we'll be talking about a Lotka-Volterra predator-prey model. This is a Lotka-Volterra competition model. Okay, so a couple of questions here about this model construction. what does this alpha ij represent when I is equal to j and when I is not equal to j? So maybe take a moment to think about that. If we have I equal to j, well, this is just the carrying capacity term, 1 over the carrying capacity term that we had in our standard logistic growth model. And this is competition within the species, essentially. So this has a special name, which is intraspecific competition. So within the species, and when I is not equal to j, then this is competition between species. So this is interspecific competition. So intra means within and inter means between. So we can then think about, okay, what are some sensible bounds for these parameters, these alpha ij's? Well, because we're talking about a competition model, in this case, we had negative signs in front of all of these terms here. So in that case, for competition, we want these alpha ij's to have a negative impact. So we want these alpha ij's to at least be non-negative. If we were talking about mutualism, say, then we would want the interspecific terms to be positive, because each species would be having a positive effect on the other species' growth rate. And if we were talking about, say, exploitation, then the interspecific term for one species would be positive and would be negative for the other. But in this case, we're going to have all negative terms. So note this way I've set this up at the moment with these alpha ij's are only because I have a minus alpha ij in the equations above. If I'd written them as plus alpha ij, then I would want these alpha ij's to be negative correspondingly. Okay. So what other sensible bounds might we have? Well, we're not at this point going to put any additional bounds, but something we'll think about shortly is thinking about the difference between inter and intraspecific competition. So we might require, for example, that our alpha ij is always less than or equal to alpha ii. In other words, we might say that interspecific, so competition between species, interspecific competition is weaker than intraspecific competition. This isn't always going to be the case, but it might well be. Why might this be the case? Well, we might expect interspecific competition to be weaker than intraspecific competition because individuals might compete more strongly with those other individuals in the environment that they are more similar to. So within a species, competition might be stronger for resources than between species. Okay, so let's think about these values, alpha ij, a little bit more, and where they actually come from. There's some different ways in which we can set them up. We could just give them some parameters that we might get from observations of species interacting in the environment. There's a sort of mathematical way that we can think about constructing them, which relies on the concept of niches. So the idea of an ecological niche is this set of in the context of resources, the types of resources that a species uses, and a niche overlap is therefore the extent to which two species share similar resources or preference for resources. So suppose then we can think about describing the utilization of different resources by species with some functions. If we think of, say, a niche axis or a resource axis as describing variation in a particular type of resource, for example, we might have a resource like food, and the axis is varying the size of that food. So this could be, say, birds feeding on seeds, and they might prefer seeds of different sizes. We can then describe a function that tells us, okay, do they tend to prefer smaller seeds or larger seeds, and how much do they use of these different types of seeds? So this is one way of thinking about a species niche, and we could extend that to thinking about many different types of resources. We're going to just focus on one type of resource here to keep things simple. So we can think about the niche of a particular species, and then we can compare that to the niche of another species and look at the extent to which they overlap. So the extent to which their resource utilization overlaps should tell us something about the extent to which they're competing with each other. If they're using a lot of the same resources, then they should be competing strongly. If they're not competing, if they're not using much of the same resources, then their niche overlap will be low, and therefore they shouldn't be competing that much. So let's think about two species here. We're going to have species 1 and species 2, and we've got here some normal distributions describing the amount of a resource that is used by a particular species. So here we're saying if this is, for example, think of this as, say, seed size, and these are two species of birds, then we're saying that species 1 prefers smaller seeds. So it has its preference, its peak preference is at a smaller value of X here. So smaller seeds, for example, and species 2 has a preference for larger seeds. So on average, it tends to prefer eating larger seeds. So these resource utilizations are just describing a normal distribution, and they have a particular mean. And here we've assumed that they've also got the same variance for simplicity. So what we really want to know then is we want to know, okay, what is their niche overlap? And the niche overlap is going to be given by this area here. What is the overlap between these two curves? So we're not going to go into a lot of detail about how we work this out, but essentially the overlap between these utilization functions is going to give us our alpha ij's. And to work this out, we need to look at the integral of our resource utilization function for species 1 and for species 2, or I and j in this case. And we want to compare that to the total area under the curve, if you like, for species 1. We'll be squaring this because we're having to essentially normalize this competition coefficient. Now, it can be shown that this, with our normal distributions above, eventually reduces down quite nice and simply to be equal to exponential of -1/2 of our mean for species I minus our mean for species j over our standard deviation squared. You will not be examined on how to derive this. This is essentially just background information to justify where this idea of a strength of competition coefficient is coming from. So essentially, this is describing this green shaded area above. And you can see that when these means are closer together, when xi is close to xj, in fact, when xi is equal to xj, this term in the brackets is going to be equal to 0. So we're going to have exponential of 0. So that's just going to equal 1. So alpha ij is equal to 1. So alpha ij is equal to 1 when xi is equal to xj. In other words, if this was intraspecific competition, then the maximum value this could take would be 1. And then as these xi's and xj's move far apart from each other, then this alpha ij is going to get smaller and smaller and tend towards 0. So in other words, the greater the resource overlap we have, the larger the alpha ij we have, and therefore the stronger competition. So just to make sure this is clear, note that our intraspecific competition, so alpha ii, whether those i's are 1s or 2s in our model above, this is equal to 1, and this is always greater than alpha ij if xi does not equal xj. So this way of setting up this type of model assumes by default that intraspecific competition is always at least as strong as interspecific competition. Okay, so that's most of the model setup to start with. Just to think about different ways in which we can apply this model or or models like this to think about competition, we can think about, for example, competition between species that leads to diversification. This is an example on this left-hand side of Darwin's finches from the Galapagos. We'll talk in a later lecture about ideas related to competition and selection, in fact, disruptive selection, leading to these finches separating into different niches, shown here by their different beak sizes. And we can also think about applying these types of models to understand competition between species like squirrels. In the UK, in fact, we have grey squirrels being invasive, and they severely harm the red squirrel population. So with our grey squirrels at the bottom, and they're invasive in the UK. So this would be an example maybe of a model where we wouldn't want to set up the intraspecific competition to be weaker than the interspecific competition. So this example on the right-hand side of the squirrel says that, okay, maybe this niche overlap isn't the greatest way of setting this up for this particular population. So it's really just to highlight that this is one way of setting up the competition coefficients, but is not the only way to do so. Okay, let's think about how we can maybe simplify this model. So if I just go back up to the model, all the way back up here, in this model, if we count up the parameters, we have one parameter here, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 parameters. So that's quite a lot of parameters to work with. But we can use a process known as non-dimensionalization to try to make our model simpler. And the key thing about non-dimensionalization is that we are not mathematically changing anything or qualitatively changing anything about our system. Essentially, we're just translating it into a problem that is mathematically equivalent by rescaling, say, our population sizes and our timescales. So let's think about how we can do this and think about how we might rescale time. So when I talk about rescaling time, what I'm saying is that our original time scale with our capital T, remember we had dn1 d capital T, that time scale may be in, say, days. But that's an arbitrary timescale to choose. We might say instead want to change that timescale so it reflects something about the populations that we're studying. So let's think about our dn1 dt equation. We have r1 n1 1 minus alpha 1 1 n1 minus alpha 1 2 n2. And what do I note here? Well, I note here that I've got this r1 on the outside of this bracket, and this is an intrinsic growth rate. So this is a rate, something that's time dependent. What I can do is I can divide both sides by this r1. And I haven't changed anything fundamental about this model. Okay, all I've done is I've just divided both sides by r1. I still got the same model. Now for species 2, I don't want to have a different timescale for species 2. I want to have the same timescale. So I'm also going to divide both sides of this equation for n2 by r1 as well. So again, I'm not changing anything about the dynamics of these models in a qualitative sense. So I'm not fundamentally changing anything, but I am changing the left and right hand side of these by dividing them both by the same rate, r1. So why have I done that? Well, now let's think about what happens if we let t, which is going to be our new timescale, be equal to r1 times by capital T. Okay, so by a simple application of the chain rule, we know that dn1 d little t is just going to be dn1 d big T times by d big T d little t. And we know d big T d little t because we know that t is equal to 1 over r1 times by little t. So we can take the derivative of this with respect to little t, and that's just going to be 1 over r1. So that means that we can write this as 1 over r1 dn1 d big T. So hopefully you've noticed at this point that what I've got here on this right-hand side is the same as what I've got here on this left-hand side. So that means that we can replace what I've circled above with dn1 d little t. And I've eliminated r1 from my first equation just by changing the time scale here. Okay, so let's think about what happens to species 2. By the same logic here, we can write down that dn2 d little t is going to be 1 over r1 dn2 d big T. So this is just applying exactly the same logic that we had on the left-hand side. And this is what we have up here. So we can replace the thing circled in red with dn2 dt. At this point, though, I haven't eliminated this r1 yet because I've still got this tricky r1 over here on this right-hand side. But r2 and r1 are just they're just numbers. In fact, you know, they're rates, but they are 2 rates, and I could replace those 2 rates with just one number. Okay, so if we set some new parameter s to be equal to r2 over r1, then I could rewrite on this right-hand side, I would get rid of this r2 over r1 and write this as s. Why have I done that? Well, it means that rather than having an r1 and r2 parameter in these 2 equations, I've now just got one parameter, s, that refers to the intrinsic growth rates. And this is telling us something about the relationship between the intrinsic growth rates of species 1 compared to species 2. So doing this means that we've eliminated one of the parameters. We've reduced the number of parameters by 1. So rather than having 6 parameters in this system, we now just have 5. Okay, so that was doing non-dimensionalization of time. We can do exactly the same by thinking about non-dimensionalization of the population sizes. So to rescale these models and non-dimensionalize them according to the population sizes, one of the typical ways we can do that is to think about the carrying capacity for each population and rescale the population size according to that. The reason we do this is that if we say let a new variable u be equal to our population size for n1 divided by the carrying capacity of n1, which we can also write in terms of this alpha 1 here. If we just think about the carrying capacities for a second, this means that this new variable u is going to be telling us how many individuals are in our population relative to the carrying capacity. We could do a similar thing for species 2, setting a new variable v equal to the proportion of our carrying capacity that is taken up by species 2. Okay, so let's take these 2 substitutions here. Again, we're not working in terms of k's here, our carrying capacities, we're working in terms of alpha 1s and alpha 2s, and so on. So let's think about species 1. So we've already changed our time scale. So we've got dn1 d little t now. Well, what is n1? Well, n1 we're defining to be equal to u divided by alpha 1. So if I rewrite this here, n1 is equal to u over alpha 1. So that means that wherever I see an n1, I can replace with u over alpha 1. So I'll write u over alpha 1 here. And this alpha 1 is just a constant, so we can bring it out the front. We just have then du dt in the derivative. So we replace the first n1 in this equation with u over alpha 1. What else do we have? We had 1 minus alpha 1 n1. Now we've defined alpha 1 n1 to be u, so this is just going to be 1 minus u here. And then we also had a minus alpha 1 2 n2. So we're going to have alpha 1 2, and n2 is going to be equal to v over alpha 2 2. So I just this over here. I can write this as n2 is equal to v over alpha 2 2. So that means rather than having an n2 here, I'm going to have a V over alpha 2, 2. Okay, so I've got rid of the n's now and put in some u's and v's. But if we notice here that we're dividing both sides by alpha 1, 1, so we can multiply both sides by alpha 1, 1, and we'll eliminate that term. So you can simplify this down to du dt is equal to u times by 1 minus u minus, I'll call this parameter a times by v. This parameter a is just equal to my alpha 1, 2 over alpha 2, 2. So the same things here. Just like with the rates on the previous slide, alpha 1, 2 and alpha 2, 2, here they're just numbers. So we could replace them by another parameter, which I'm going to call a. So I've rescaled them, and now I'm essentially saying a is telling me something about the extent to which intraspecific competition for species 2 on species 1 compares to the strength of intraspecific competition for species 2. So there is a biological interpretation for this. So we've eliminated another parameter now. We've actually only got one parameter in my equation for species 1. So du dt is telling me about the rescaled population size and rescaled time for population 1. And there's only actually one parameter in this model, a. Okay, so we can do exactly the same thing for species 2. Remember here, we have a relationship between v, so we're going to, and n2, so we're going to want to write n2 dn2 dt in terms of v's. So just like above, we can write dn2 dt is equal to d by dt of v over alpha 2, 2. That alpha 2, 2 is just a constant, so it comes out the front. And then everywhere where we saw an n2 previously, we're going to write v over alpha 2, 2. We had this s out the front before because that was from our rates, non-dimensionalization above. And then inside the bracket, we're going to have 1 minus alpha 2, 1 times by n1. Remember, n1 we are replacing with u over alpha 1, 1. Over u over alpha 1, 1. And then we had a minus, go back up here. Here we had a minus alpha 2, 2, n2, which is just equal to v. So here we have a minus v at the end. Just like before, we have a division by alpha 2, 2 on both sides. So those cancel out, and we can simplify this down to dv dt is equal to s times by v times by 1 minus. Now here I'm going to define another parameter b times by u, and a minus v at the end, where I'm defining this b to be equal to this alpha 2, 1 over alpha 1, 1 here. Again, just like we talked about above, these alphas are just numbers. So rather than writing both of them down, all that matters is the relationship between alpha 2, 1 and alpha 1, 1. So now there are just two parameters in this equation and one parameter in the other equation. And so we've reduced the dimensionality of this problem from requiring us to think about 6 parameters. Well, now we only need to think about 3. So this is why we do non-dimensionalization where we can. It essentially reduces the problem down from having more parameters to fewer parameters, and it means that we can focus in on the key relationships between parameters that matter. So here, for example, all that matters is the relationship between this alpha 2, 1 and the alpha 1, 1, and there are lots of different alpha 2, 1s and alpha 1, 1s that could give you the same value of b. But all we care about is what is this value of b. And so essentially we're creating mathematical problems that are equivalent to our original model, but are simpler to analyze. Okay, that's it for today. There is a self-study problem at the end of this set of notes as well. And next time we are going to be looking at how we can analyze this simplified competition model. Okay, thanks very much.